All right. More people coming in. All right. Good morning, everyone. We're back. Kol hatchalot kashot. It's hard to get back into the year-round mood, but here we are. And Rosh Hashanah is upon us. This year, Rosh Hashanah falls the first day on Shabbat. So we're going to take a look at an issue that is very relevant. I've called it before the sound of silence, the shushing. There will be no shofar. And lots of messages can be found within that act. And it's a fascinating subject, I find, on a whole host of levels. But we're going to start it with a headline. The class is called Ripped from the Headlines, that you could get them on the sources that are in the meeting chat. And this is a headline just from a couple of weeks ago. It's Israel news site, Israel 365 News. And it is advocacy group petitions Ben Gvir to blow shofar on the Temple Mount on Rosh Hashanah. All right, so the question, it came up, as the article mentions, a group of advocates, including rabbis and a former Knesset member, has submitted an official request to Itamar Ben Gvir, Israel's Minister of National Security, asking for permission to blow the shofar on the Temple Mount on the holiday of Rosh Hashanah next month. I'm not sure if they're asking for permission from Ben Gvir to blow the shofar or go up to the Temple Mount. A little bit unclear. We Jews who ascend and pray and study on the Temple Mount, each according to his ability, we ask you by virtue of your authority granted to you by law to instruct the police and the officers assigned to the Temple Mount to allow Jews to enter the Temple Mount on Shabbat Rosh Hashanah 5784, the first day of the 7th month of Tishrei, September 16th, 2023, the first of the 7th month according to the accepted calendar, in order to carry out the traditional prayers for biblically mandated Jewish New Year called the Rosh Hashanah, which includes the blowing of the shofar, the main part of the holy day, and the essential Rosh Hashanah mitzvah. We request this permission due to the principle of religious equality for all religions and peoples mandated by Israel with Israeli law. The letter was signed by Rabbi Avraham Balas, former member of Knesset Moshe Feiglin, Rabbi Professor Hillel Weiss, Zev Liebler, Asal Mordechai, and advisor Aviad Visoli. Rabbi Weiss explained that if permission is given, this will mark the 4th Rosh Hashanah since 5677, on which the shofar will be blown in the front of a Beit Din, a rabbinic court. So let's unpack a little bit what's in this article. Right? They're looking for permission so that they will be able to go to the Temple Mount unimpeded when they go to worship and pray and have the Rosh Hashanah service. They're looking for permission for that. Now, what about blowing shofar on Shabbos? They seem to feel that that is fine, and as is indicated, it has been done before in front of a Beit Din. And so for some of you, that may be news to you. The likelihood is that this will probably not be granted the official permission, but I guess we'll have to wait and see. But and as we've seen before, as when we discussed some of the issues, religion state in Israel, arguing for equal rights and freedom of religion to be able to go to the Temple Mount is an interesting argument to make. It's a similar argument that the women of the wall make to be able to have their type of services at the Western Wall. Something tells me that some of these petitioners wouldn't accept that type of behavior. But again, this is the article that we're confronted with. Let's go. Let's have permission to blow shofar on the Temple Mount this Shabbat. Questions or reactions to the article? Okay. So we know we don't blow shofar on Shabbos. We've probably lived through that before. We probably also know that there's some kind of reason relating to Shabbos and carrying and the like, and or maybe that it's muktzah and one of the forbidden activities. So let's learn a little Gemara. Let's go to the source of where this comes from, which is the Talmud in Rosh Hashanah. And it's on the source sheet, source number 2. So the Talmud begins with a Mishnah when Rosh Hashanah occurs on Shabbat, in the temple, they would sound the shofar as usual. Oh, so maybe the temple mount will be different. However, they would not sound it in the rest of the country outside the temple. Okay. After the temple was destroyed, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai instituted that the people should sound the shofar on Shabbat in every place where there is a court of 23 judges. So in the times of the temple, they'd only blow in the temple. Afterwards, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai ruled that they can blow it in other places as well, wherever there's a court. In general, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was very much in favor of instituting rules that would replicate the activities that were done in the temple in other places and other ways as well. Another classic example is that they used to only take lulav and esrog on the first day of Sukkot. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai says, no, we should take it all 7, the same way they did in the temple. This is his idea of zecher lamikdash. We should remember the temple service by acting in ways as if the temple was still standing. Okay, so Rabbi Eliezer said Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai instituted this practice only in Yavne, but nowhere else. Okay, so Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, the Mishnah states that he did this, that they would blow shofar on Shabbat where there's a court. Rabbi Eliezer says, no, that was only in Yavne. The sages responded to him. He instituted the practice both in Yavne and any place where there is a court. How could it only be in his place? It doesn't make any sense. So any place that has a court, 23 judges seem to be part of the initial takana as commentary to the Mishnah. It's discussed more broadly in the Gemara. We're not going to go into it right here. Then the Mishnah continues based on the view of the sages that it wasn't just Yavne, but there was a place that was special. Jerusalem in earlier times had this additional superiority over Yavne after Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai instituted this practice. For in any city whose residents could see Jerusalem and hear the sounding of the shofar from there, and which was near to Jerusalem, people come to Jerusalem from there, they would sound the shofar there as well, as it was considered part of Jerusalem. But in Yavne, it would only be sounding the shofar in the court itself. So Yerushalayim, all of the neighborhoods surrounding Yerushalayim that had access to Yerushalayim, they would also blow. This calls to mind on Purim time. When do they celebrate Purim? They celebrate Purim on the 14th or on the 15th. Jerusalem celebrates it on the 15th. Those neighborhoods around Jerusalem generally also do as well. There's a similar ruling. So that's the Mishnah. The Gemara wants to know, wait a second, who says you don't blow shofar on Shabbos? Right? The Mishnah started off by saying when Rosh Hashanah falls on Shabbos, they'd only blow the shofar in the temple, and they wouldn't blow it anywhere else. Why not? And that's what the Gemara wants to understand. How do we know that the shofar is not sounded on Shabbat? We're continuing in source number 2. Rabbi Levi bar Lachman said, the Rabbi Chama bar Chanina said, one verse with regard to Rosh Hashanah says, a zichron shruah. You're going to have a memorial of shofar. Another verse says, a day of blowing, yom shruah. So Rosh Hashanah is described as zichron shruah, remembering the blast, and yom shruah, a day of blasting. The apparent contradiction is not difficult. Here, the verse in which the shofar is only being remembered but not sounded is when the festival occurs on Shabbat. And you only remember the shofar because you're not going to blow it. There, the verse in which the shofar is actually sounded is called a festival, is when the festival occurs on a weekday, Yom Shruah. Right? The Torah is presenting us with a way of understanding that when Rosh Hashanah is on Shabbos, it is Zichron Shruah. We remember the shofar, but don't blow it. When Rosh Hashanah is on a weekday, we blow the shofar. It's a day of shofar blowing. So that's a little bit unclear, but if that's the case, then how would they blow it in the Beit HaMikdash on the first day? If the Torah is saying that it's all shofar is not blown on Shabbat, how do they do in the Beit HaMikdash? The Gemara addresses this, attempts to resolve this as to maybe it's really not fully prohibited. And then the Gemara takes a second track. Rava said, by Torah law, one is permitted to sound the shofar on Rosh Hashanah, even on Shabbat. It was the sages who decreed that it's prohibited. This is in accordance to the opinion of Rabbah. As Rabbah said, all are obligated to sound the shofar on Rosh Hashanah, but not all are experts in sounding the shofar. Therefore, the sages instituted a decree that the shofar should not be sounded on Shabbat, lest one take the shofar in his hand, go to an expert to learn how to sound it, or have him sound it for him, and he might carry 4 cubits in the public domain and desecrate Shabbat. So the Mishnah said when Rosh Hashanah falls on Shabbat, they would only blow it in the Beit HaMikdash. Rabbi Yochanan Zakkai says afterwards you could blow it in Beit Din. It was the rabbis who say you can't blow on Shabbat. So therefore, Rabbi Yochanan Zakkai is making a rule that we could blow it on Shabbat. See, this idea of Shema Yavirenu Arba Amot B'Shut Harabim. Maybe you'll carry 4 cubits outside, right? You're not allowed to carry in the public domain on Shabbat. Now, most of us are not so familiar or aware or following that because these days, Orthodox Jews live in places where there is an Eruv, and we do carry on Shabbat. Also, the biblical violation of carrying only takes place in a biblical public domain, Reshut Harabim, which are few and far between, certainly not in where most people live. The major exceptions locally that may apply for this are places like Brooklyn and Manhattan, and even those places, because it's not only based on population, it's not only based on size, there are all sorts of variables that go into this. But from the Gemara, the rationale is you can blow shofar on Shabbos. The Torah would want you to blow shofar on Shabbos. The verses, it makes sense. And in fact, on Saturday, on the first day of Rosh Hashanah, we will recite the version of the text, Zichron Shura, as opposed to Yom Trua. We'll call it a Yom Zichron Shura because we're not going to have the shofar blown. But that's a rabbinic enactment. Similarly, as the Talmud says, it's a rabbinic enactment the same way that we don't use lulav on the first day, and we don't blow, and we don't read Megillah when Purim falls on Shabbos. Now that one never happened because our calendar works in such a way these days that we never have that problem. 14 Adar never falls on a Saturday. But the Gemara is explaining that the rabbi said don't blow shofar on Shabbos, so we don't blow shofar on Shabbos. Now, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai then came along and said, well, we do blow shofar on Shabbos in the place where there is a Beit Din. If there's a Beit Din, we blow shofar on Shabbos. That was Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai's takana. He said, the rabbi said you can't blow. Well, we're going to amend that to you can't blow in ordinary places, but you could blow in places where there is a court. And this actually happened. The Talmud continues, second page towards the top. The sages taught, once Rosh Hashanah occurred on Shabbat, and all the cities gathered at the Great Sanhedrin in Yavne for the festival prayers. Okay, let's see what happens. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai said to the sons of Betera, who were the leading halachic authorities of the generation, let's sound the shofar, as we did in the temple. Right? Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai wants to implement his rule. So the sages said to him, let's discuss whether or not this is actually permitted. He said to them, no, let's sound it, and afterwards, when there's time, let's discuss the matter. Right? We're going to sit around all day. We have to decide now. Let's just blow. I made the decree that we're allowed to blow. Let's just do it, and then we'll discuss it. All right, what's the expression? It's better to ask forgiveness than permission. After they sounded the shofar, the sons of Betera said, okay, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, let's now discuss the issue. See, he said to them, we already blew the shofar in Yavne. We are not going to refute a ruling after the action was taken. He kind of lured the rabbis in to follow his ruling and said, hey, rabbis, we just blew the shofar. You allowed it. Now you want to undo it and talk about it? So we see from the Mishnah and Gemara, a couple of things. We see from this Mishnah and Gemara that there seemed to be the practice of not blowing the shofar on Shabbos, and the Gemara says that seems to be a rabbinic enactment. After the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai said, well, the rabbi said not to blow. I'm going to amend that we are going to blow, and we're going to blow on Shabbos where there's a Beit Din, where there's a rabbinical court. And in fact, kachava, that is what indeed happened in that situation. There seemed to be some pushback by the sages who wanted to discuss it further. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai said, let's just do it and then discuss it. And then once it was done, they had it, it was decided and didn't go back from it. So we see that this is something that actually may be practiced. This was done. They blew shofar on Shabbos in the place of a Bezdin. That's the Talmudic background for not blowing shofar on Shabbos. But that background is not, we never blow shofar on Shabbos. The Gemara seems to conclude that we do blow shofar on Shabbos in accordance with Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai's ruling in a place where there is a Bezdin. Stop here for questions and comments, because now we have to understand, well, what about today? What about Jerusalem today? What kind of Beit Din is required today? But before that, any questions on the presentation of the practice as understood by the sages in the Talmud? All right, as my ninth grade high school Talmud teacher would say, clear as mud. Okay, then we can go further. So throughout the generations, we in our lifetimes, we haven't blown shofar. We see on Shabbos, we see that there is a push, even to this day, not only a halachic push, but also in civil law in Israel to have it done on the Temple Mount today. Is that because it's the Temple Mount, because it's Jerusalem, because it's a rabbinical court? Let's look at some of those variables. So Maimonides, source number 3, does seem to recognize that, yes, the Talmud concluded with, we don't blow shofar on Shabbos is a rabbinical rule. When there's a court, we could blow shofar on Shabbos. So the Rambam says, at present, while the temple is destroyed, whenever a court whose judges receive smicha in Eretz Yisrael permanently holds sessions, the shofar is sounded on the Sabbath. Furthermore, the shofar is sounded on the Sabbath only in a court that has sanctified the new moon. So part of this story is the Rambam agrees. You blow shofar when Rosh Hashanah falls on Shabbos in front of a beis din. But that's only half the story, because the Rambam then continues. What kind of beis din, what kind of rabbinical court is it? Well, they have to have smicha, the official smicha, not the smicha the rabbis today get ordination in rabbinical school. They had to have this chain of tradition going back to Moses, which we believe was broken. Now, after the times of the Rambam, they actually tried to reintroduce it in the times of Rabbi Yosef Cairo, the author of the Shulchan Aruch, and there's an opinion that it was restarted. But the Rambam is basically saying, sure, blow shofar on Shabbos on Rosh Hashanah, but you have to have a court of smuchin, rabbis with original smicha. And, by the way, they have to be permanently holding sessions. And, by the way, these have to be the same rabbis who sanctified the new moon. Well, guess what? Do we do that anymore? Rabbis sanctifying the new moon? We have a calendar today. And the Rambam knew that. So basically, the Rambam is presenting, yes, sure, blow shofar and Rosh Hashanah falls on Shabbos with the rabbis, but then list an impossible string of conditions that would ensure that we never have those rabbis assembled in order to blow shofar when Rosh Hashanah falls on Shabbos. And that seems to be the direction that the halachic consensus seems to take. In a way, it seems to me that this hesitation to actually implement Rabbi Yochanan Zakkai's ruling of blowing shofar when Rosh Hashanah falls on Shabbos in the presence of a court, the hesitation already started at the beginning. Think about it. The Talmud presents us with the Bnei B'Teira, the sages who were pushing back against Rabbi Yochanan Zakkai. And Rabbi Yochanan Zakkai quasi-tricked them into setting the precedent. He's like, okay, we'll just set the precedent now, and then we'll discuss it. And then they forestalled it for discussion. To me, this sounds a little bit like the Gemara is leaving off on a bit of a negative note for blowing shofar when Rosh Hashanah falls on Shabbos. Rabbi Yochanan Zakkai may have wanted to do this, but the sages were pushing back. And as often, the Gemara doesn't give us the final halacha follows X, Y. The Gemara doesn't usually conclude we follow Rabbi Yochanan Zakkai or we follow the sages. But usually, where the sages have concerns, we will follow it. And the Rambam understands that the sages did have concerns, and that the only way we can mitigate or alleviate those concerns would have been if the Beit Din that the blowing was taking place in front of was indeed such a entrenched, serious, authorized calendar-setting Beit Din. And that's how the Rambam concludes. And so does the Shulchan Aruch. If the holy day of Rosh Hashanah, source 4, falls on Shabbat, we do not sound the shofar. Ramah says it's even forbidden to handle a shofar unless you need it. For example, you're using it to hold water, or it's on your chair and you have to move it. But in general, the shofar has become persona non grata when Rosh Hashanah falls on Shabbos. Now, this is the standard halachic approach. Right? The Gemara presents the issue, presents both a reason to go forward with it, and the Gemara goes forward with it, presents us with Rabbi Yochanan Zakkai's ruling, presents us with the story that happened this way, presents us with the rabbi's hesitation, and then the halachic path forward, Rambam Shulchan Aruch, we don't blow shofar on Shabbos. I always like to say that halacha is a path, is a highway, is the way we go. And sometimes there are multiple lanes. And for shofar on Shabbos, there is an additional lane that doesn't follow Rambam and Shulchan Aruch. Rabbeinu Asher, the Rush, who is one of the medieval commentaries who starts collecting the halachot of the Talmud, points out that Rabbi Yitzchak Alfasi, right, 11th century Moroccan leading rabbi and scholar commentator, also was the first to really formulate the halachot, someone who the Rambam is very much influenced, someone who the Shulchan Aruch considers one of the great pillars of how we codify Jewish law. So the Rosh writes, and I'll translate it, source number 5, Amru alav al Rav Alfas, Shahaya Tokea b'Rosh Hashanah shecholios b'Shabbos. Rav Alfas would blow shofar on Rosh Hashanah when it fell on Shabbos. V'chein mashma b'hilchosav shehevi mimra de Rav Huna in Beis Din v'ein darko lahavi el davar hanoeg b'zman hazeh. Because Rabbi Alfas's halachos, if you look at the halachot of Rabbi Yitzchak Alfasi, the Rif, it's not written the way we're used to codes of Jewish law being written today, because that was amended by Yaakov ben Asher, the Shulchan Aruch. The halachos of the Rif is when the Rif wants us to know what to do, he quotes the statement of the Talmud. And he quotes the statement of the Talmud means that this is in a practical rule that we have to follow. So Rabbi Yitzchak Alfasi, the Rif, quotes this rule of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai's ruling of blowing shofar on Shabbos. If he had left it out, that would be just as telling. He would be saying, we don't follow Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai's rule about blowing shofar when Rosh Hashanah falls on Shabbos in the Beis Din. But he includes Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai's ruling that we blow shofar when Rosh Hashanah falls on Shabbos in front of Beis Din. And that's actually what he did. And he did that, and he included this ruling, the statement of the Talmud, in his halachot. But as it points out, the last line of the source, his students didn't follow this. And he also says that the Rif said that he didn't have to be a Sanhedrin; it could be any Beis Din, any recognized Beis Din. That included someone great in the generation. So the Rosh quotes the Rif that seems to take Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai's ruling, and that path forward has, yes, blow shofar when Rosh Hashanah falls on Shabbos in front of a Beit Din. It doesn't have to be the greatest, it doesn't have to be the Sanhedrin. He doesn't apply all of the impossible standards that the Rambam does, that we don't do it, and he leaves open the possibility that we do it, and he did it. But his students did not, which is very telling in its own right. So the Talmud presents Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai's ruling. The halachic process veers away and recognizes the concerns or adds impossible conditions. Shulchan Aruch, practically speaking, we don't blow shofar on Shabbos. There is a lane that does quote the Rif and tries to build a case for doing so, but that's not the lane that the Jewish people have taken over these generations. Questions or comments before we look at the resuscitation of the Rif? Okay. So before we look at some, as was mentioned in the opening article, that they're trying to have the 4th time of blowing shofar on Rosh Hashanah falling on Shabbos since 1916. Before we look at those efforts, it's kind of an interesting question, this idea that if there's a mitzvah, how can the rabbis prevent us from fulfilling the mitzvah? And can they eliminate the mitzvah? And so first, it's an important principle that's found in the Talmud that yesh koach biyad chachamim, the sages have the authority, la'akor davar min haTorah b'shev al ta'aseh, that they can prevent us from performing a mitzvah if they're telling us to do nothing. And the rabbis here aren't telling us to do a positive action. They're saying, Rosh Hashanah, there's a mitzvah to blow the shofar. The rabbis are saying, don't blow the shofar. They're telling you not to perform the mitzvah. Shev al taseh, it's a passive declaration. If the rabbis told you to eat on Yom Kippur, well, that would be telling you to perform an action that would violate the Torah. Here, the rabbis aren't telling you to actively violate; they're telling you to passively violate. Shevi al ta'aseh, and which may be difficult. It gives the rabbis a lot of power, maybe too much power. I never thought so, but it gives the rabbis too much power. So there actually comes about a different direction, at least with shofar, that maybe really is, as we said at the beginning, that when the Torah says Yom Teruah, the day of the shofar is a weekday, and Zichron Teruah, the remembering the shofar is on Shabbos, maybe that's ultimately the intent of the Torah. And this whole thing about the rabbis having the authority, that's the direction that the Babylonian Talmud goes to explain it, for a whole host of reasons, but really the Torah obligation to blow shofar is only on a weekday. But the Avnei Nezer, Rabbi Alvin Bornstein, points out wonders, well, does the mitzvah still exist? What happens if the rabbis doing this, are you sinning by blowing shofar on Shabbos because the rabbis told you shouldn't? Or does the mitzvah exist and the practice is not to? But if you did blow the shofar, there's still a metaphysical mitzvah. You've performed a mitzvah, even though the rabbis told you not to do it. It's more of a philosophical question than a practical question. But the Avnei Nezer writes in source number 6, since the rabbis can't uproot, rabbis can only uproot by a mitzvah by telling us to do nothing, right? That the rabbis have told us to, in many occasions, has told us not to do something. Are they saying there's no? Are they saying that there's no mitzvah, or are they telling us just not to do the mitzvah? So Avnei Nezer points out, Lo akru hachachamim hamitzvah ta'aseh klal she'batel hamitzvah litko b'Shabbos. D'im kein harei chachamim okrim hamitzvah biyadayim, because then they'd be telling us there's no mitzvah. V'zeh ein koach biyadam lasos. They can't do this. It's forbidden for rabbis to uproot and say the mitzvahs don't apply. The mitzvah still applies. So there's a mitzvah that the way the Avnei Nezer is presenting this is that there still is a mitzvah. The rabbis are just telling us hands off. But that would indicate that if someone did blow the shofar on Rosh Hashanah on Shabbos, there is a mitzvah. Now the rabbi said not to, but there still is a mitzvah. And if that's still the case, that also opens up a lane towards what the Rif is saying. We're not saying that there's no mitzvah to blow shofar. We're saying there is a mitzvah to blow shofar, but the halachic practice has been to not blow shofar. But if that mitzvah still exists, that could be a very tempting religious activity that would motivate us to try and find a way to do it. We shouldn't give up our desire to do it. We're not doing it, but maybe that's not the case. Maybe we're giving up too easily and applying the opinions and the approaches of the Rambam and the Shulchan Aruch and not giving enough due diligence or credence to the Rif here. If there's still a mitzvah, we should try and pursue it. The Rif and the Rambam, on some level, gave up, and that's how the Jewish practice has gone. But maybe, if there is still a mitzvah, well, why don't we try to resuscitate the Rif and find conditions that it could be done? And that's, in fact, what happened in Israel in particular. Remember, we're trying to find ways to make this as keeping with the decree of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai that we're going to blow shofar when Rosh Hashanah falls on Shabbos, that there was an effort, a real desire to build upon the existing mitzvah to still sound the shofar. Can we find a halachic pathway to doing so? And source number 7 is an article by Ari Greenspan and Ari Zivotofsky. These are the guys who investigate like giraffes and swordfish and all that other fun stuff. It's from Mishpacha magazine. You can find the article online on their website. And they talk about in 1870, an astounding personality moved to Jerusalem from Hungary, Rabbi Akiva Yosef Schlesinger. Upon reaching Eretz Yisrael, Rabbi Schlesinger was penniless and found a job as the Rav in charge of the mikveh in the Tiferes Yisrael Shul in the old city of Jerusalem. It was built, the second in size only to the Churva, was built by Nissen Beck, the first Hebrew printer in the city. Longing for the Mikdash, Rabbi Schlesinger rented an apartment adjacent to the Kotel and started the first permanent minyan there. He wrote, I moved near the Western Wall where no Jew has lived since the destruction, where for 4 years I had the privilege of living in the base medrash I built there. Right, so he's living, he's definitely very enthusiastic and temple intoxicated. He's living right up against the Kotel. As in many issues, Rav Schlesinger was a kanai, a zealot, with regard to the mitzvah of blowing shofar as well. Right. One of the other aspects of this story is that he was, the full title of the article is Shofar on Shabbos and the burning of the tzitzis in Jerusalem. He also was very into fulfilling the mitzvah of tzitzis as fully as possible. So he adopted the tcheles of the Ruzhiner Rebbe. Right, we talked about this issue also previously. The idea of trying to reinstitute some of the mitzvahs that had been lost for a long time. And originally, the Ruzhiner Rebbe founded Cheles. Most people rejected it, but Rabbi Schlesinger said, "Oh, I can fulfill the mitzvah perfectly in its fullest form." He adopted it. Other sages decried him, and in one famous or infamous incident, they tore his tzitzis off his body and burned them to highlight that this was wrong. So, he had a reputation for pushing the envelope. So he wanted to blow the shofar on Rosh Hashanah also. In 5632, 1871, the year after he arrived in Jerusalem, Rosh Hashanah fell on Shabbos, and he was anxious to blow shofar now that he was in the holy city. He presented his reasoning to Rav Meir Auerbach of Kalish, the Imrei Bina, who rejected it. In 1881, Rosh Hashanah was again on Shabbos, and Rav Schlesinger issued a pamphlet explaining why the shofar should be blown in Jerusalem that year. So he wrote up his arguments. Although Rosh Hashanah fell on Shabbos several years later, the major controversy erupted only in 1904-1905, when Rosh Hashanah fell on Shabbos 2 years in a row. Rav Schlesinger implored the rabbinic leadership of Jerusalem to blow shofar those years. Drawing largely on his arguments of 30 years earlier, Rav Schlesinger presented a series of reasons to permit shofar. Since we hold like the Rif in observing 2 days of Rosh Hashanah in Eretz Yisrael, which hadn't been done until this time, right? If the only reason we have 2 days of Rosh Hashanah in Israel is the Rif, then we should hold like him and blowing shofar even on the first days on Shabbos, right? The Rif has created the practice in Israel, so we should follow him on blowing shofar when Rosh Hashanah falls on Shabbos. In addition, he asserted regarding the fear that one would carry the shofar in a public domain, many authorities hold that today there is no biblical public domain Rishus HaRabim, and certainly not in the Jerusalem of his time when the gates of the old city were closed nightly. Rav Schlesinger, so he again pushing the envelope. We can follow the Rif. There's no Rishus HaRabim. We're in Israel. We can gather together a Beis Din. He was appealing to the rabbinic leadership, and he made inroads, but no one was willing to support him publicly, including one rabbi. It was Rav Kook's father-in-law, Rav Avram Dov Rabinowitz, who was really worried because he was an elderly man in 1904, 1905. He was worried he would never biblically fulfill the mitzvah of shofar again. I guess our fulfillment is only rabbinic. So therefore, because of the whole idea of we're only hearing on the second day of Yom Tov. So there are legends and rumors and whispers about Rav Rabinowitz acquiescing, and said that he would go stand outside the wall of the place where Rav Schlesinger would be blowing shofar. We don't really have hard, concrete evidence that this was that it actually transpired, but there are numerous tellings of the story that this is exactly what he did. He tried to get the acquiescence publicly of the rabbinic leadership. When he didn't, in his shul, in his minyan, he had a Sephardi Beis Din, an Ashkenaz Beis Din, and it was in Jerusalem, and all the rationale that he was giving, and he blew the shofar. We do not have the security footage from that synagogue. We don't know for sure, but he was making a strong case. He seemed adamant. He didn't want to publicize without getting formal agreement from the rabbis of Jerusalem, but it is possible, even likely, that he did so under the conditions that he set for himself. One of the arguments that he made to Rabbi Shmuel Salant, the rabbi of Jerusalem, on behalf of Russian Jewry, which was then suffering terrible pogroms, Rav Schlesinger, 1904, 1905, Rav Schlesinger contended that Mordechai and Esther had overridden Pesach with a fast day, and that had defeated Haman's evil decree. It's well known, he argued, that the shofar has the power of saving Jews. And here they were talking about a rabbinic violation by one person. So how dare they abandon their brethren in Russia and not save them? Right. All you guys have to do is listen. I'm the one blowing the shofar. The world is in trouble. Ukraine today, I don't know. We've got to find a couple of rabbis to join me, and we'll see what happens. But that's a very midrashic, philosophic, spiritual approach. Forget the halachas. The Jews are in trouble. It was good enough for Mordechai and Esther, which is never explicit that they canceled it. We just know, because based on the dating and the timing of the Megillah, we generally don't learn halachas from this. But here he was trying to push his envelope. In addition to all the halachic arguments, manish tana, how is this any different than what they did? So the history of shofar blowing on Shabbos recently became even more interesting and intriguing with the publication of 1985 of a newly discovered startling piyut for Rosh Hashanah. Found in the Cairo Geniza, the liturgical poem is enigmatic, but seems to indicate that at the time it was recited, Jews did blow shofar on Shabbos in the presence of the Bezdin. However, instead of being held, the shofar was tied to a pillar in the synagogue, and the blower merely put his mouth to it and blew. The date and province of the piyut are uncertain, but seems to be describing a custom in the land of Israel up until the 12th century. So there seemed to be more of an appetite earlier on, right, in keeping with the Rif, that was his practice, that they tried to do it. Here they tried to mitigate it by not holding the shofar. The shofar was there, the person put their lips on it and just blew. And seemingly that would be even less of a violation on the one hand, and all of the arguments to blow on the other. And it would make sense that if this had been up until the 12th century, because as we saw earlier, the Rif students did not follow their teacher. This began to lose momentum and acceptance around that time. So what about these rabbis today? Where we began, we conclude where we started. So basically there has been a resuscitation, a resurrection of this approach, especially by those who are behind the more recent attempt to start a Sanhedrin that in the last 20, 30 years, one of the leaders of this effort was Rabbi Adin Steinsaltz, Zichrono Livracha. And they created a Sanhedrin, and you can Google their website. It's like, great, Google Sanhedrin's website. Who would have thought? But they really felt that now was the time. We have the Jews returning. You have the state of Israel. You have more Torah. Let's try and build a mechanism to reignite the rabbinic authority to that will recapture some of these rabbinic laws. Let's bring us back to the times of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. And they started one, and they actually blew shofar. And it was reported on the Israeli press. You see source number 8, Haaretz, September 2006. A group of worshipers, some of them from New Sanhedrin group, headed by Rabbi Adin Steinsaltz, that sees itself as a successor of the original Sanhedrin, violated Jewish law by blowing the shofar on Shabbat during Rosh Hashanah services. So this is the eyewitness account of Haaretz covering that blowing of the shofar on Shabbos. The services were held at the Beit HaBechira Yeshiva in Jerusalem's Old City. That's the place where Rabbi Schlesinger, 100 years ago, had also blown shofar if he blew it. Current Jewish law forbids the blowing of the shofar on the Sabbath for fear of violating prohibitions against carrying objects in public. Same law prohibits carrying the lulav on Shabbat and Sukkot holiday, and reading Purim Megillah when the holiday falls on the Sabbath. This is like, you're learning Gemara from Haaretz. Rabbi Kiva Yosef Schlesinger blew the shofar 101 years ago, but this almost clandestinely out of fear of ultra-Orthodox zealots in Jerusalem, although we saw that some of them may have agreed with him. Schlesinger was a Zionist Haredi who believed that blowing the shofar on Shabbat would halt the spread of pogroms in Russia. Some researchers claim this initiative earned him silent approval of Jerusalem's chief rabbis, Rabbi Shmuel Salant, Elijah David Rabinowitz, and Rabbi Yaakov Shaul El Yashar. One of the people behind Sunday shofar blowing was Professor Hillel Weiss. You'll notice that Professor Hillel Weiss of Elkanah is one of the ones petitioning Itamar Ben-Gvir to do it this year on the Temple Mount. A major figure in the movement to establish a third temple in Jerusalem. A press release issued before Rosh Hashanah by the planners said that now when we are facing the war of Gog and Magog, the apocalyptic war described in the book of Ezekiel, shall we not postpone the decree by sounding the shofar? Right, invoking similar sentiments as Rav Schlesinger. Weiss published an article in Bar-Ilan University's weekly Torah study pamphlet in which he cited Jewish sources implying that the shofar was blown on Rosh Hashanah when the holiday fell on Shabbat, even after the destruction of the temple, obviously sources which we have seen. Most of the worshippers of the Saturday service were ultra-Orthodox. Rabbi Tzvi Idan, the first president of the new Sanhedrin, attended. So the saga continues. Rabbi Schlesinger started the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century, was resurrected and reignited with the new Sanhedrin, 100 years later, and 15, 20 years ago. And we see that it's still, those same individuals are promoting this to this very day. So we'll have to read Haaretz the day after Rosh Hashanah and get a sense of if they're covering any of them enough, that any of them are public enough that they will be noticed and press-worthy, newsworthy, written up about after Rosh Hashanah. At the end of the day, it doesn't change our practice, although the Zivotofsky tells the story of there is a legend that the Vilna Gaon was going to make Aliyah. Right? The Vilna Gaon was a great lover of Zion. He has students who made Aliyah, and created, some of that initial Yishuv, the non-Hasidic as parts of the Yishuv. There were followers of the Hasidic rabbis who also moved at that time, but they say the Vilna Gaon wanted to go, but he was worried because the year that he had made the plans enough to move forward, Rosh Hashanah, first day of Rosh Hashanah fell on Shabbos. And the Vilna Gaon was convinced that you should blow shofar. You could blow shofar in Israel with a Bez and Rosh Hashanah falls on Shabbos, and he would be compelled to do so. But that would bring the opposition of everyone else against him, and he was not ready for that and did not move and never tried again. Again, legend, but it highlights how this element of halacha, of shofar, when Rosh Hashanah falls on Shabbos, has a much broader discussion than just not blowing. I have mentioned that to me it feels that when Rosh Hashanah falls on Shabbos and we don't blow shofar, we are, in a sense, recognizing that the shofar isn't the most important thing for Rosh Hashanah. It's the most famous, but what's most important is our connection to God and tradition, which tells us that we don't blow shofar on Shabbos. To me, the expression that we add into the Rosh Hashanah liturgy, because it comes from the Shabbat liturgy, of Yismechu v'malchutcha, we rejoice in your kingship. When Rosh Hashanah falls on Shabbos, we engage more with that aspect of our relationship with God than the shofrot aspect of our relationship with God. And hopefully that will just have to suffice this year and any year when Rosh Hashanah, first day of Rosh Hashanah, falls on Shabbos. So we'll do the best that we can, and hopefully that will help ride our way into the book of life for a happy, healthy, sweet new year in the coming year.